you do that, you inevitably start to make mistakes, and you start to think that, well, just working on myself is somehow selfish. But if you realize that it is a wholeness, it is a holistic system, and it is a deeply, deeply interconnected kind of membrane, if you like, a fourth dimensional membrane that just emanates, then you can say, well, in that case, if I consolidate my knowledge, and if I grow, and if I refine what I'm doing and make it more graceful and elegant, that actually affects everything then, doesn't it? And he says, well, yeah, because you're connected to everything. So the
Mm-hmm.
power and the resonance with which you do that will determine the breadth and the depth of that resonance. And it's also brilliantly put together because it will affect the people who are ready for it most first. And you magnetize people to you who you can teach and who you can learn from. So in my work, again, one cannot help but note that when you're dealing with people, you just you remark on how incredible it is, the synchronicities with what they teach you that day, even just in passing conversation. And I just think, well, that is so perfectly aligned with where I'm at right now. And that knowledge has never come to me in any way, shape, or form before. And so
Mm-hmm.
there is a very specific structure to this where there's a you magnetize what's appropriate at the time that it happens. And so if there is sometimes, again, it's curious, it's odd in fact, to know the extreme contrast between self-aware, spiritually aligned people who are talking about the kind of things that we're talking about and people who do not do any of those things. And yesterday, as an example, I was sat in a coffee shop over here in Oregon with my little computer, just having a coffee, putting some notes together for a presentation next month. And I was kind of researching some stuff and talking about all this, very clever and metaphysically fascinating stuff, and thinking, yeah, how can I put this forward to the audience that will engage them, and let me try and do this differently, and yeah, I'll build that in and I'll do this. And then some people sat at the table next to me, and they were kind of just talking about, the gas prices have gone up, and there's a new pie in the shop on the corner, and the cherries are like really nice. And they were talking about a completely different aspect, a completely different layer of reality. And yet it struck me that it was no less or more real than what I was doing. And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, my contemplations were more abstracted than theirs were to some extent. And I think that's part of the teaching of universal truth, which is that you don't assume that because you're on the spiritual path, as we might say, that there's something special about that. The only thing that's special about it is that it's always a low number of people who are aware that that's going on. Everybody, you could say, is on a spiritual path, but when you become conscious of it, you become a minority, and there's no denying that really, because most people are not interested in that stuff. And yet, from this vantage point, as you say, always taking the bigger picture, the big view, you can look upon those people and think this is your spiritual path, and the fact that you're not consciously articulating that in your thoughts and in your deeds doesn't matter, quite frankly, right now. It doesn't matter. The only thing that is a good idea is to bring this, as we quite popularly say nowadays, this authenticity into what we do and into how we are and into what we bring to our lives. So, always for me, a lot of the things we're talking about, particularly with phenomena and matrix wizardry, is to say, well, how can you integrate that into your everyday life? Because for me, if it's entirely separate and they're just nice thoughts that are kind of interesting, then the relevance is questionable. For me,
Mm-hmm.
it has to be something that you can literally walk into everyday experiences, and that's the intrigue and the pleasure of the this path for me, is the integration of those things and bringing it into the experiences that you physically have. Because although I absolutely agree, Thomas, with your sort of view that this is data essentially, it's little bits of information wiggling around, and we construct it as mental model of the world. Um, it's necessarily a model that we have to reference, and so it's real because of its consistency, really, I would say, and that's what marks it out as a compelling model, and that's what people call real. That concreteness is that consistency. Um, and as I sometimes say to people, the only difference between the dream I had last night and this dream is that this dream here that we all kind of like experience is very consistent, and it persists and it endures and it looks very similar from one day to the next. But it is it is a training mechanism, and part of that training is to understand that awareness is quite a precious gift, and it is something to be treated with a bit of grace and a bit of reverence, because it is the foundation of the whole thing. And as you move closer to that, I think you do start to shift density, and that's a very personal journey. But there do seem to be these tidal flows of it as well. So I do think that there's also an awakening process that is accelerating a little bit. So that tiny percentage is just bumped up a little bit on the world grid. And I've never met so many conscious, engaged people before. And I think that's quite unusual. And even 20 years ago, that was kind of low. There was a lot of people talking about it. And also in the last 18 months, meeting young people like in the 20s who are really aware and really engaged. They're not just talking about certain books and certain people and throwing buzzwords around. They're actually doing it. They're actually walking the talk. That I think is very encouraging. So while we can see that the mainstream isn't there, if you go to conferences and workshops and write books and stuff, you're gonna engage with another subculture, who are existing and resonating closer to the fringe, closer to the developmental edge. And I think that's necessarily the way it has to be, and I think that's okay.
Yeah, well, not only okay, but necessary.
Yeah.
It has to be. Yeah, it has to be that way. We are evolving, and evolution doesn't skip steps. So people are where they need to be. They are right at the level of challenge where that challenge can be met and end up as knowledge.
And you have to
Um,
respect that, don't you? Because
yeah,
it can
and
be
that's just the way it
frustrating.
is. Yeah, they
Yeah, but
can't.
it's
I mean,
go ahead.
we don't look at 3 year old children and say mean things about them because they don't act like adults. We say, well, they are as they are. They're in a process and they're growing. And one day they will be adults, but right now they are who they are. And it's not like that's something inferior or that the children are, lesser beings. They just are in a process. And part of that, and they have to be at that point. They can't skip the process of childhood. They have to grow up. So it's necessary. One of the ways I describe what you were talking about, I talk about awareness at the being level and awareness at the intellectual level, which is pretty much what you were
Yes.
saying there. You have awareness at the being level. It means it's integrated into your core. It's part of your being. It's a fundamental part of your consciousness. Where you have awareness at the intellectual level means you know the buzzwords, you can discuss the issue, you kind of understand the structure, but that's very different than absorbing that information down at the being level. At the intellectual level, you can read the most uh, wise of writings. You can read the books that have all the important things in them, and it really won't make a bit of difference. You'll be able to discuss them at a cocktail party, but they won't
Yeah.
affect your life
Yeah.
until you transfer them into the awareness at the being level, at your core. But you got to start someplace, and often people start with the intellect. The intellect leads sometimes, and then the rest of it builds slowly as understanding seeps deeper. But all of this is as it has to be. We're in a learning lab. We have lots of different consciousness here, and they're all evolving in their own way, at their own right. I mean, in their own time, and that's the way it has to be. There's no way that you can bump people up. You can't drag somebody into knowledge. They have to discover it on their own. There's really no way to teach anybody anything. And there I mean at the being level. Being level has to come from experience and has to develop from the inside out. It can't get pushed into somebody from the outside in. So it's just the nature of the reality that we're in.
Okay, let me insert another question here.
You're not doing too well on your list of questions, I bet.
But I don't mind.
You're probably a tenth of the way down your list.
I don't mind at all because your conversation is really interesting. So, but let's move on a little bit here because there are three things I'd like to tie in. Tom just said that he talked to spiritual people who were kind of disencouraged, and Neil talked about the separation of people or who have separating experiences, the way they experience the world. And for that, I'd like to move into the next question, which is divergent trends in the world. With the internet, we have the possibility that people can more easily create their own reality bubble. They can have their own reality, their own TV show, their own radio show, their own website, their own blog. So it's a lot more easy now to create our own reality bubble. And on the other hand, many people do not believe anymore in the mainstream story of reality, and because it just makes less and less sense. So my question here is, while we have these diverging trends on one hand, will a convergence of ideas and concepts have to happen on the level of the intellect, or might the convergence happen on a transcendental level or on a being level, as Tom would say, and the mind does not even has to grasp that the solution is being worked out here without him arranging all the details. So how important is a left brain convergence of our worldviews in order to create a solution for the global challenges we have ahead? And that would be maybe to Neil first and then to Tom.
I think there's quite a number of parts to that question, isn't there?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, let's deal with left brain, right brain. I understand, strictly speaking, that it's not quite as simple as that if you speak to people who work in these fields. But we understand, don't we, that in principle, the left brain is really to do with logic, and the right brain is to do with creativity. The left brain is linear, and the right brain is more kind of non-linear and spontaneous, and so on. It's funny because I know people who are very, very, very left brain, and I also know people who are very, very, very right brain, and they excel, of course, in certain things. So if you've got, like, let's take someone who we all know, like, say, the artist Van Gogh as a right brainer, produces stunning creative work, but can't kind of conduct himself, can't eat properly, has lots of problems, can't string sentences together too well, and his exposure to the energy that we might say is exemplified in the right brain is at the cost, is sacrifices his left brain stuff. I do think that we have to understand that there's a certain equilibrium that becomes advantageous on the spiritual path. A lot of it is about poise, really. In the book I've just written, I kind of use the words like poise and grace and elegance and stuff like that quite a lot. And I think it's a little bit like the difference between how, let's say, a deer, the animal, a deer moves through a forest, and how a tourist moves through a forest. And if you watch how a deer moves, it has a certain balance of skill, of logic, of integration with its environment. It doesn't necessarily consider itself as entirely separate from what's going on around it. Whereas a human who moves through a forest does consider itself